Technique, mumble. Technique, mumble is a way of saying you don't need to get it exactly right as far as pronunciation goes. People will speak differently, people will have different accents. Technique mumble is a kind of way of saying, hey, don't worry about it. It's not the biggest deal. Technique mumble. It's a permission to get things almost right. This might be a good point to say that in general I aim to use a reconstructed Koine pronunciation along the lines of Randall Booth and others. But my pronunciation is not perfect, and sometimes you'll hear me slip in some Erasmian because I've often taught students who use Erasmian, and so sometimes it's not quite perfect. But that's my aim, that's my goal. So technique mumble applies both to the teacher and to the students. Technique, try this at home. I'm just making up a few techniques here. Technique, try this at home is, it's my way of saying sometimes there aren't other players at the table with you. Sometimes you're watching a video, sometimes you're working on Skype or over the internet. Technique, try this at home is a way of using our imagination. So imagine I have some other players at the table. Technique, try this at home. And it goes along with an actual technique. Technique, setup. Technique, setup. Setup is any time you stop the game and you rearrange the layout. Sometimes you'll want to arrange objects, arrange the game to set up certain expressions, certain ways of speaking, to teach or to draw pieces of language. So technique, setup. And technique, try this at home. Technique, start at the beginning. Ti esti tutto. Tutto esti poterion. Ara tutto esti melena graphis. Uhi, tutto huc esti melena graphis. Alla tutto esti poterion. Tinos esti tutto to poterion. Tutto to poterion esti mu. Tinos esti tutto to poterion. Tutto to poterion esti mu. Tinos esti tutto to poterion. Tutto to poterion esti mu. Mu che su. Tinos esti aufte erutra graphis. Aufte erutra graphis esti su. Tinos esti aufte erutra graphis. Aufte erutra graphis esti su. Tinos esti aufte erutra graphis. Erutra graphis aufte esti su. Tinos esti tutto to poterion. To poterion esti mu. Tinos esti aufte erutra graphis. Aufte erutra graphis esti su. Mu, su. Mu, su. Mu, su. Technique, Craigslist. Technique, Craigslist is a way of organizing pieces of information, of bringing together words into a list based on Craigslist, which may or may not be applicable. But technique, Craigslist is a way of stringing together similar concepts, similar words in a set. So technique, Craigslist, here we have mu, su. Mu, su. And we can build upon that list as we go. Tinos esti tutto to poterion. Tutto to poterion esti mu. Che Tinos esti aute erutra graphis. Aute esti how fascinating. Technique, how fascinating, is a way of drawing attention to the moments when things go wrong and we stuff up, or to the moments where we understand something, have a fresh insight into the language. Technique, how fascinating, is also a way of breaking tension. So anytime someone says something wrong and they realize, oh, I've stuffed up, they should say, how fascinating. And everyone else should join in. Everyone else at the table should say, oh, how fascinating. I find this technique a little bit hard to get people involved in. But it really helps the process. So technique, how fascinating. And you know, if you are the teacher, it's a way of taking the pressure off yourself. Sometimes we get things wrong. Sometimes we say things that are just not quite right. Particularly, like me, if you are working with ancient languages, if you are not a native or fluent speaker, technique, how fascinating, is a way of saying, I'm learning too. I'm acquiring this language in a new way. So, where were we? That's right. Technique, start at the beginning. Ti esti tutto. Tutto esti topoterion mu. Ti esti tutto. Aute esti erutra graphis. Che tinos esti aute erutra graphis. Aute esti. How fascinating. Let's try that again. Aute erutra graphis esti su. Mu su. Tinos. Tinos esti utos o litos. Utos o litos esti avtes. Avtes. Utos o litos esti avtes. Mu su. Avtes. Tinos esti utos o litos. Utos solitos esti avtes. Che aute e melena graphis esti tinos. Aute e melena graphis esti avtu. Avtes avtu. Tinos esti aute e melena graphis. Aute e melena graphis esti avtu. Tinos esti aute e melena graphis. Aute e melena graphis esti avtu. So back to technique. Craigslist. Mu, su. Avtu, avtes. And this is where technique, try this at home, comes into play. There's a difference between avtu and avtes. A difference that's not obvious when I'm imagining players at the table. If you know Greek, you'll know what that difference is, and if you don't, well, you'll need to wait until I get some other players to join me. Or you can make a guess, or you can look it up. Mu, su, avtu, avtes. Mu, su, avtu, avtes. Mu, su, avtu, avtes. Technique, let's start at the beginning. Tinos esti tutto topoterion. Tutto topoterion esti mu. Tinos esti utos o litos. Utos o litos esti avtes. Uc esti su. Esti avtes. Tinos esti avte e erutra graphis. Avte e erutra graphis esti su. Che tinos esti avte e melena graphis. Avte e melena graphis esti avtu. Esti avtu. Technique, word order. You know, some languages have a more fixed word order, like English. Other languages have a much more free word order. And so there's a question about how do you teach that? How do you teach technique, word order? I don't have a strategy. I have patterns, but this is something I'm still thinking about. You'll see that there are some default word orders that I use, and sometimes just in the flow of the game I mix them up. So technique, word order, is not really a technique, it's a thought, it's a question for us. How do you approach that? How do you as a teacher want to control that? Do you want to establish a fixed word order to begin with? Do you want to begin with a couple of options and variations? Greek, as you'll see, is quite fluid, but not the most fluid. Technique, word order is just a way of saying, hey, let's think about this. What are you doing? How are you playing?